Chapter 8. If Drannith hadn't already done it once, riding back to Drannith on a monster would have been the strangest experience of her life. They'd met Barrow and his monster Zeph, well away from the wrecked Coppercoat camp, and Vivien had made hurried introductions. Barrow was odd enough, with his horned helmet and grave demeanor, but Drannith found herself a little taken aback by Zeph. The monster's sheer size was unnerving. Roll was as big as a bear, and the winged cat had been larger still. But Zeph dwarfed both of them. His eyes were bigger than Drannith's head, and his fangs were the size of a great sword. She remembered him from the battle at the Ozolith, where he'd fought to a standstill the nightmare snake that had destroyed Vermilion. Once they climbed aboard, though, the white cat's enormity made for a peaceful ride, and his long stride ate up the ground, even when he kept to a pace Roll could match. Drannith slept for a while, exhausted, nestled amid downy white fur, while Vivien kept watch. She'd hoped to beat the survivors of the army back to Drannith, but in spite of the monster's speed, it quickly became clear that wasn't going to happen. At first, they had to circle out of their way to avoid Lukka's monsters, who were spread out in a wide arc following the Coppercoats. Then, as they reached the fourth ring, they started encountering Drannith farmers and shepherds, who naturally fled screaming at the sight of Zeph. This made Drannith rethink her approach. The last time she'd approached Drannith on Monsterback, it hadn't ended well. At her urging, Zeph had hidden amid some woods to wait for nightfall. Once it was dark, they started for the city again, threading their way through the third ring's scattered towns and the second ring's forts. Fortunately, the crystal detectors the defenders usually relied on to warn them of monsters were useless, since Lukka's oncoming horde had pegged them all off the scale. Several hours before dawn, therefore, Drannith once again found herself approaching the secondary wall, the outer boundary of the first ring, and the first unavoidable layer of Drannith's defenses. This time, she devoted some thought to it, and came up alone and on foot, with Zeph hunkered down in the darkness out of sight. In spite of the late hour, the wall bristled with crossbow troops. They were out of the direct path of Lukka's horde, but Drannith had no doubt every Coppercoat was on edge. She came into the light of the wall's torches and glowing crystals at a slow walk, with her arms over her head. "Halt!" someone shouted at her. "Who's there?" "Captain Drannith, of the Citadel Staff," she shouted back. "General Kudro's daughter. May I approach?" There was a moment of confusion and barely audible bickering on the wall. Then the voice called back, "Come on then, I'll open the gate." Drannith lowered her hands and walked the last few yards as the iron-banded gate swung open with a deep creak. A Coppercoat sergeant and two rankers appeared, offering her stiff salutes. The sergeant, an older man with a mustache that reminded her of her father's, looked her over with a worried expression. "Had a hard time of it, have you?" the man said. Drannith imagined she didn't look her best. The river swim and subsequent flight hadn't left her uniform clean, and her hair was a horror. She nodded. "You've had the news from the city?" "About the tactical withdrawal?" the sergeant said. "We had a runner. There's supposed to be an army of monsters coming at the city." "Tactical withdrawal? That's one way of putting it." "Let me guess," Drannith said. "Colonel Bride is in command?" "Yes, sir. Apparently, the general is away on a special assignment." "Bride hasn't told everyone my father is dead." That was Interesting. Drina shoved down the surge of emotion the thought carried with it, and tried to focus on the present. Sergeant, I'm going to need you and your men to unload their weapons. I'm bringing some new allies to help with the city's defense, and I don't want any incidents. You understand? Ah. Yes, sir. But that violates our standing order. I'm overriding your orders in the name of the General. The sergeant blinked, then snapped to attention. Yes, sir. I'll attend to it at once. He turned around stiffly and started barking commands to his men. The crossbows on the wall were lowered and their bolts removed. Drina waited a few minutes, then turned and whistled high and long. Now, Sergeant, she shouted up to the wall. Tell your men not to panic. Everything is under control. In spite of this admonition, there were a few screams when Zeph lumbered out of the darkness, his eyes glowing blue-white, and sparks crawling along his horns. Drina could hear the sergeant berating his soldiers to stay calm, and mentally raised her estimation of the man. It was a big thing to ask of a soldier trained all his life to fight monsters like this one. No crossbow bolts rose to meet them as the great white cat reached the wall and stepped daintily over it, Barrow waving to the soldiers below from his position astride Zeph's neck. Roll came chuffing up to the gate, with Bryn clinging to his fur. The girl looked at the wall distrustfully. It'll be all right, Drina said. They won't shoot. Never been in a city before, Bryn muttered, as she urged Roll through the gate. Is it true there's, like, hundreds of people all living together? After passing through the secondary wall, Drina remounted Zeph and directed Barrow to lead the cat on a path that kept them out of the most populated areas of the first ring. It was impossible to avoid notice altogether, though, since the strip of land between the walls was crowded with suburbs, barracks, and manufactories. Drina pictured reports of their presence racing back into the city, triggering panic. By the time dawn was breaking, they'd made it to the main wall, and, as she'd predicted, the defenses were bristling with weapons, ballistae, manned and ready, ranks of crossbows, and spears visible atop the high battlements. Seeing the packed ramparts, Drina felt her heart sinking. This isn't going to work. Vivien stepped up beside her. What's wrong? They'll never listen to me. Drina's fists clenched. Colonel Bride is already there. He's next in the chain of command, and he's always thought I was a useless little girl trading on my father's name. He won't help us. He's not the only one up there. Vivien looked up at the wall and the distant soldiers. Those men will be watching. Bride is the ranking officer. By right, he should be in command. And yet, Vivien gave a slight smile. I have known a great many soldiers over years. They make a great fuss over the rules in times of peace, but in a crisis, she waved a hand behind them in the direction of the oncoming horde. It all comes down to authority, and more important still, the appearance of authority. Appearance of authority. Drina wiped her sweaty palms on her trousers and took a deep breath. Right. Once again, she had Zeph stay back out of ballista range while she went forward on foot. Drina cupped her hands as she walked forward, ready to repeat her introduction. But before she could, the postern gates swung open. The small door set into the enormous main gate let out a party of a dozen soldiers. Drina recognized the ornate uniforms of the Citadel Guard, and at their head a party of high-ranking officers, led by the familiar face of Colonel Bride. Captain Drina, the colonel said. They were standing at the base of the wall, well within earshot of the soldiers on the battlements. Jarina steeled herself, aware that anything that happened here would be reported throughout the city in minutes. Unlike the sergeant at the secondary wall, there was enough light now that Zeph was clearly visible, sitting on his haunches in the dusty road. "Colonel," Jarina said. "It is good to see you alive," Bride said. "I had feared the worst after what happened." "Likewise," Jarina said. "Given how quickly the defenses of the camp collapsed, I assumed you'd been killed before you could organize them." "I was taken by surprise, like everyone else. I took command during the retreat." "And now you're in charge of the city?" "Until your father returns," Bride said. "My father is dead," Jarina raised her voice. "General Kudro is dead, killed by the traitor Lukka." Bride glared at her, but he raised his voice to match. "In which case, as the ranking officer of the Coppercoats, I must assume responsibility for the defense of the city." He turned to look at Zeph. "In pursuance of which, Captain, I must ask why you appear to have come here in the company of two monsters." "These monsters are Zeph and Roll. They are bonded to Barrow and Bryn respectively, and they have offered to assist in the defense of Drannith. Given the circumstances, I thought it best to accept their offer."
"You thought it best?" Bride narrowed his eyes. "You have exceeded your authority, Captain."
Jarina took a step closer, and her tone dropped to a whisper. "Don't be an ass, Bride. Take command if you like, but you know we need all the help we can get."
"I know no such thing," Bride said. "The walls of Drannith have stood for centuries. They will weather this storm as well."
"We've never faced anything like this," Jarina said. "We can't treat Lukka's army like just another bunch of monsters. My father was too blind to see that, and it cost him his life, along with the lives of gods know how many Coppercoats. I need you to do better."
"And open the gates to your friendly monsters. I must say, Captain, this raises serious doubts about your loyalties. After all, if Captain Lukka can side with the enemies of humanity, why not his fiancée?"
Jarina was aware of mutters behind Bride, among the other senior officers. She looked them over, gauging their expressions. They were men and women who'd grown up under her father's rule, who'd spent their whole careers in the shadow of the general. To them, Kudro had loomed as eternal as the walls of Drannith, and now they were adrift. "Colonel Bride," Jarina said, "you will not allow my allies to enter the city?"
"I will not," Bride said stoutly. "And you will only be entering in chains."
"The appearance of authority." "In that case," Jarina said, "in my father's name, I am relieving you of command of Drannith's defenses. Please step aside."
"What?" Bride barked a laugh. "You can't do that. You don't have the authority."
"Major Humran." Jarina focused her attention on a woman standing just behind Bride. She tried her best to ignore the pounding of her heart, focusing on exuding an air of authority. "Please open the gate and clear the streets beyond. I wouldn't want anyone to get hurt." There was a long moment of silence. The thing about Colonel Bride, Jarina reflected, was that he really believed in the rules. He'd worked his way up by following them, or more precisely, by twisting them to his personal advantage. Adept at the kind of bureaucratic infighting that no military hierarchy can avoid. Under ordinary circumstances, it was a skill that had served him well. But Vivien was right. Circumstances were no longer ordinary. The chain of command gave Bride the authority. According to the rules and the oaths they had sworn, every Coppercoat should have obeyed his orders over Drannith. But they were humans, not machines, and they were scared. General Kudro, the rock of their universe, had vanished, and here was his daughter, giving instructions in a tone that brooked no nonsense, and perhaps offering help, which all but the most blinkered had to know was desperately needed. The thing about Colonel Bride was that nobody actually liked him very much. "Sir," Major Humrun saluted, fist to chest, and turned to the Citadel Guard sergeant. "Open the gate and set up a cordon to disperse the crowd."
"What?" Bride squawked. "You can't do that."
"I just did," Drannith said, as the other officers turned away and started issuing instructions. "Now, I suggest you scurry back to your quarters and stay out of the way before I have you arrested." For the moment, everyone seemed to be following her orders. Drannith suspected it wouldn't last. At some point, when the crisis was past, assuming they all survived, military authority would reassert itself, and someone would notice that she didn't have any real basis to be telling anyone what to do. In the meantime, she was the general's daughter, and more to the point, she'd brought in a monster the size of a house. That might unsettle some, but those who'd fought Lukka's horde at the river understood what it would mean to have a few monsters on their side. Now she was in the Citadel again, changed into a fresh uniform, but still without sleep except for what she'd snatched on Zeph's back. Vivien, Barrow, and Bryn were with her, the two monsters curled up outside in the courtyard, watched by nervous guards, along with the unflappable Major Humrun. A map of Drannith and its environs was spread on the table. "Lukka could have attacked by now," Major Humrun said. "Monsters were harrying us all the way back from the river to the second ring. Why would he hold back?" "His fastest monsters could have reached the wall by now," Vivien said. "But I suspect much of his forces moves more slowly. He'll want to keep them together for one overwhelming push." "That still doesn't buy us much time," Drannith said. "Another day at most." "I agree," Barrow said. "He will strike tomorrow." Humrun nodded, scowling. Drannith ran her finger along the line that represented the secondary wall and sighed. "That gives us one night to evacuate the first ring. At least everything on the northern side of the city." "Evacuate?" the Major frowned. "You don't think we can hold the secondary wall?" "I don't think we should even try. There aren't enough ballistae to stop Lukka's flyers, and his larger monsters can simply step over it. Whoever we leave there is going to be slaughtered." "But the first ring is full of valuable targets," Humrun said. "The foundries, the academy. I doubt Lukka will waste time pillaging. He thinks he's here to save the city, not destroy it. He'll be coming here, to the Citadel, if he can manage it." She shrugged. "Either way, we don't have a choice." "I'll give the orders," the Major said. "Barrow, have you contacted your friends?" "I have," the young man said gravely. There was something solemn about him, though his horned helmet and white fur looked outlandish in the heart of Coppercoat territory. "The Great Crystal allows my voice to reach farther than normal." "Veen said she's on her way," Bryn piped up. "And a couple of others." "They're Maybe more who could hear, but not reply, Barrow said. I'll be able to reach them as they come closer. Make sure you do, Drannith said. I don't want any of our allies getting shot. She glanced at Humran, who gave a gruff nod. Even with help, the Major said, this is going to be a disaster. We never anticipated anything like this. Dozens of monsters attacking the walls at once. They're going to break through, and even if we take them down one by one, the cost. It is not the monsters who are the threat, Vivien said. It is Lukka, and the power the Ozolith has granted him. Even if his army is wiped out, he can simply gather another. She's right, Drannith said. We'll have to bait him out, and take him down. She couldn't bring herself to say kill him. Not yet, though she knew deep in her heart that was what it had to come to. After all, what else do you do with a man who can control an army of monsters? Throw him in a prison? Her heart felt that it would tear in two, her mind leaping between the memory of Lukka in her rooms, kissing her with such attentive passion, and his sword in her father's heart. What do we use for bait? Humran said. Drannith caught Vivien's eye and sighed. Me, she said. By the next morning, Drannith hadn't managed to get much more sleep. A couple of hours before dawn, grabbed at Major Humran's insistence, after she was sure the evacuation was proceeding according to plan. All night, the civilians who lived and worked in the first ring had streamed in through the gates, followed by the defenders of the secondary wall. The ordinary citizens were shocked at the need to abandon the first ring, something that hadn't been necessary for as long as anyone could remember. The soldiers, who'd heard the rumors of what they were facing, were relieved to be able to fight atop the city walls' comforting bulk. Both groups were surprised by the monsters waiting in the market square, just inside the main northern gate. Zeph and Roll were there, but they'd been joined by others, as Barrow's call had gone out and Bonders had responded. There was an emerald-scaled lizard snake, accompanied by a slender woman dressed all in shades of green, and a great winged boar, prickle-weathered and ridden by a gnarled old man who laughed and shouted in an incomprehensible accent. A boy, younger than Bryn, brought in a walking tree that was taller than the wall itself, and Drannith had to arrange for a section to be cleared so the thing could clamber over. More were arriving all the time, and gradually the guards were getting used to the idea, so Drannith didn't have to worry about anyone opening fire in the darkness. It still wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. Barrow had said they could expect only a couple dozen Bonders in the best case, which meant their monsters would be outnumbered by 10 to 1 or more against the horde Lukka could bring against them. Bryn insisted the Bonders' monsters would fight harder, but Drannith couldn't count on that. I'll have to hold them in reserve. She and Vivien had crafted a plan, but she hesitated to put it into motion. Even if it worked, it would cost Coppercoat lives by the score. So will anything else, she told herself. Scores are better than hundreds, and hundreds are better than thousands. She thought of her father, the iron resolve that had helped him lead the city through crisis after crisis. She wondered if Major Humran and the others were listening to her simply because the situation was so nightmarish that none of them wanted to be blamed when it went wrong. When the sun rose, Drannith was atop the North Bastion, the massive gatehouse that overlooked the main northern road leading away from the city. It was the most direct route, and she ordered it heavily defended. The roof packed with ballistae and battlements thick with soldiers. The Coppercoats had filed into their positions in the pre-dawn darkness, the warning crystals on their coats glowing like tiny green stars. They spread out in a vast arc with a bastion at the center, lining the wall that towered over both the city behind it and the suburbs and barracks of the first ring. The sun crept over the horizon, light spreading across the land like the curtain coming up on a play. In the golden glow of dawn, the defenders were greeted with a sight that no Coppercoat had ever confronted. Not a single monster, not even a pack, but an army, spread out through the first ring in a neat line. Directly opposite the bastion was a true giant, a monstrous elemental-clad thing like a turtle, on whose back was a rocky mountain peak, somehow white with snow. Its craggy top rose nearly as high as the wall itself, and smaller monsters clung to it like swarming ants. To either side, the pattern was the same, the largest monsters forming the line, with their smaller brethren taking shelter around them. Not that any of the monsters were small. Distance made it hard to see, but Drannith guessed some of the little ones were the size of a bull. But they were still dwarfed by the largest of their kind. There were representatives of all 5 clades, black scaled nightmares with their multiple eyes, hairy snorting beasts, long-fanged dinosaurs, sleek cats, and elementals trailing smoke, flames, or vaporous mist. Flanking the elemental turtle were a 6-legged, 4-tusked boar that was nearly as big and looked meaner, and a nightmare that looked like a worm carried on hundreds of legs, each flank lined with glowing red eyes, 4 long tendrils weaving through the air above it. Even the air was full of the enemy. Airy things swooped and dove, bird-like creatures screeched, and a hovering whale-shaped nightmare blinked down at the humans with huge sleepy eyes. "Gods above," Drannith heard the soldiers around her muttering, praying. "There's so many. We're going to die." She took a deep breath and shouted as loud as she could manage. "Make ready to fire!" The cry was picked up and repeated by officers and sergeants all along the wall. "Make ready to fire! Make ready to fire! Make ready to fire!" Crossbows clicked and clattered, and ballistae groaned as they rotated to face their targets. Drannith turned to Vivien and Bryn, who were waiting behind her for their final instructions. Vivien was calm, while Bryn stared at the assembled monsters in obvious fascination. "Remember the plan," Drannith told the bonder. "You and your friends deal with anything that gets over the walls. But don't split up, and don't show yourself to Lukka." "Got it," Bryn said. "Barrow says he and the others are ready." "Vivien, we're going to need help dealing with the flyers. The ballistae can't handle this many." "I'll do what I can," Vivien said. She drew her strange forked bow and tested its tension. "My power does have its limits." "I know," Drannith said. "Thank you." "They're coming!" a soldier shouted. Drannith turned back to the battlement and watched as the great turtle took a slow, thunderous step forward. High atop it, she fancied she could see a single human figure sitting where he could watch the show. "Here we go." The flyers darted forward first, and the ballistae opened fire with devastating effect. Dealing with flying monsters had always been one of Drannith's primary concerns. The city's great walls and stout defenders were useless against a creature that could simply soar over them, and raids by flying monsters had always been one of the more persistent dangers the Coppercoats had faced. The walls were studded with heavy ballistae, some armed with long, heavy bolts to engage big targets, some with bundles of steel darts that would break open in flight, spreading out to catch more agile opponents. A dozen monsters went down in the first volley. A crackling electric hawk was snatched out of the sky by a ballista bolt, falling into the first ring and crushing a factory building to rubble. A web-winged dinosaur dove directly at the bastion, screeching defiance and was met by a rising cloud of crossbow bolts that left it looking like a pincushion. Its torn wings failed it, and the thing crashed into the stone face of the wall and slid down in a smear of blood. Farther overhead, other monsters tried to soar above the range of the ballistae, hoping to descend on the city once they were over the wall. Soon enough, however, the second line of defense came into play, and crackling energy wreathed the green crystal towers that dotted the Drannith skyline. The Coppercoats' arcane core, working in teams of a dozen mages channeling spells through the great green crystals, sending bolts of lightning and blasts of fire tearing into the monsters. More creatures fell, shrieking as they burned or were torn to pieces. The larger, sturdier monsters had more luck. The nightmare whale, black and encrusted with strange growths, drifted slowly into range of the wall. It had one ballista bolt sticking out of it already, and as Darina watched, another one caught it in the underbelly, but it didn't seem to notice the projectiles. Crossbow bolts rose to meet it, mostly falling short, while it unfolded vast tentacles that hung down in great ropey strands. Soldiers scrambled out of the way as they reached for the wall. One, unfortunate, didn't get clear, and the tendril wrapped around his ankle, pulling him screaming into the air. The whale thing opened up a wide, toothy maw and tossed the soldier inside like he was a grape. Vivien stepped up on the battlement and loosed 3 arrows in quick succession, the shafts somehow rising farther and faster than even a crossbow bolt. Green energy bloomed all around them, coalescing into 3 enormous birds. All 3 had sharp beaks and long curving claws, and they swooped toward the nightmare whale, harassing it like dogs trying to drive off a bear, tearing great chunks from its side with each pass. Black blood fell in great drops, watering the ground below. By this point, the slower monsters on the ground were getting into range. The turtle was still coming, a whole battalion of smaller monsters hooting and roaring on its upper peak, like soldiers riding a living siege tower. The boar surged ahead of it, head lowered, charging the wall as though it meant to break through. Darina grabbed the battlement for support as it impacted. The blow was hard enough to shake the stone bastion. The thing backed off, shaking itself, but before it could line up another charge, it was hit by 3 ballista bolts in quick succession. It reared madly and charged off, ripping up a great swath in the inner ring. More ballista bolts were aimed at the multi-legged nightmare, but they were having less effect, glancing off its overlapping scales. It reached the wall and started to climb it vertically, sticky-footed as a fly. Darina barked an order, and squads of Coppercoats rushed to meet it, armed with long spears and slashing great swords. Men and women were pulled off the wall by its flailing tendrils, falling screaming to their doom, but the soldiers determinedly chopped their way into the thing's head, cracking and shredding its armor until it fell backward, legs waving wildly in the air. "Back to the battlements," Darina said. "Here they come!" The turtle had reached the walls. Ballista bolts had as much effect on it as toothpicks, ricocheting wildly off its rock-lined shell. The creature itself was almost docile, too slow to offer much threat, but its craggy upper slope came within yards of the battlements. That was enough for the monsters riding it, who jumped over en masse, swarming up and over the stones and across the bastion roof. There were dozens of them, cats with green fur and spreading leaves for manes, quick, darting nightmare scorpions, dinosaurs with claws like sickles, and snorting ape-like beasts. They tore into the defenders who came forward to meet them, matching steel against tooth and scale. Darina saw an ape thing go down, whimpering with a dozen swords through it, watched a woman scream as a dinosaur ripped her open in a spray of gore, then got skewered itself by a thrown spear. Vivien danced through the melee, a great green wolf at her side, her arrows finding eyes and throats as the translucent creature bit and tore. Then a monster reared up in front of her, a shrieking rat-tailed thing as big as a horse, and there was no time for watching the battle as a whole. Drannith drew her sword, jumped back out of the way of the creature's swiping claws, and carved a bloody notch in its dripping nose. It chittered madly, pushing forward, and Drannith gave ground until a citadel guard with a great sword rushed it from the side. The woman slammed her weapon into the monster's flank where it stuck, then had to duck as the thing turned and tried to tear her throat out. With it distracted, Drannith darted in, shoving her sword through its eye and into its brain. It spasmed, then collapsed, twitching. Drannith whipped the blood off her sword, panting. "Drannith!" Drannith turned, saw the girl grimly slinging stone after stone into the advancing monsters. "Message from Barrow!" The Coppercoats were moving forward, pushing the tide of monsters back to the battlements. Drannith shoved backward, sheathing her sword, and ran to Bryn's side. The girl was damp with sweat and had a bloody cut on the side of her head, but seemed otherwise uninjured. "What's happening?" Drannith said. "Monsters are getting through," Bryn said. "Barrow and Zeph stopped a few, but there are more everywhere. Some of the flyers, some that came up from the ground. He says they're tearing apart the buildings, and people are running away." Damn. She'd always known they wouldn't be able to stop everything. "He wants to send the Bonders out to hunt them down," Bryn went on. "No," Drannith said. "We need them if we're going to have any chance to end this." She turned, looking back at the battle. "Have him get the Bonders together by the gate. It's almost time." The rush of small monsters from the turtle's back had pressed the defenders hard, but Drannith had concentrated the Coppercoats' best forces at the bastion, and their training and experience had made the difference. Dead and dying monsters littered the roof, but the ballistae were still firing, and crossbow bolts snapped out in every direction. Here, at least, they were holding. The same couldn't be said for the situation further down the wall. Lukka's strategy had been simple, but effective. Finding the main gate held too strongly, he'd spread his army out, using his numbers to probe the defenses for a weak spot. Monsters had hit the wall in a dozen places, larger ones helping their smaller brethren get up to the battlements, cooperating in a way Drannith's architects had never imagined. The result was that the defenses were being overrun, monsters cutting through the outmatched Coppercoats and jumping down the inside of the wall to raise havoc in the city. As I expected, people were dying everywhere, soldiers on the wall, civilians in the streets, because of the orders I gave. Drannith took a deep breath. Let's hope it's worth it. She went to the battlement, putting her spyglass to her eye. She caught a glimpse of Lukka earlier, high atop the turtle's back. He was still there on his feet now, his eyes glowing a fierce orange as he channeled the Ozolith's power. "Bryn," Drannith shouted. "I'm going. Tell Barrow." "I got it," the girl shouted back. "Be careful." "I will cover you," Vivien said. "Good luck." "I'm going to need it," Drannith muttered. She checked her sword in its scabbard, clambering up on the battlement, and gauged the distance to the swaying, rocky back of the turtle. Then she closed her eyes and jumped. It was only a few yards over and down, but it felt like she spent an eternity hanging in the air. When she struck the rock, it was hard enough to knock the breath out of her and scrape the skin from her palms. She scrambled to her feet, wobbling as the great turtle shifted underneath her. A few monsters remained on the rocky mountaintop, but they were all dead or dying, riddled with crossbow bolts. Further ahead, sheltered from the defenders' fire by a rocky outcrop, Lukka stared at nothing, his eyes aglow with orange light. Drannith started toward him, picking her way carefully through the rocks. When she was close enough for a rush, she drew her sword. He turned, blinking, and his eyes went wide. His cheek was scabbed over where her dagger had cut it. "Drina," he breathed. "Hello, Lukka," she said.
"I thought you were dead."
"I nearly was," she said, shifting as the turtle moved.
"You're still trying to kill me."
He gave her a wan smile. "Did you seriously think anyone was going to let you into the city? After what you did to my father?"
"No,"
Lukka said frankly.
"I understand now. Your father, he was a stubborn old man. But Drannith is full of stubborn old men. The only way I'm going to get my home back is to take it."
He clenched his fist.
"The people will submit, or they'll die. We'll build a new Drannith on the ashes of whoever tries to stop us."
"You really are insane," Drina said.
"I'm not."
He gave her a sad look, and for a moment he seemed so much like that old Lukka that her heart flopped in her chest.
"All I wanted was to come home, Drina. But this is the only way now."
"We'll never submit," she leveled her sword. "This is the end, Lukka."
"We'll see."
Lukka smiled, that old cocky grin. Drina rushed him. He didn't make a move toward his hooked blade, just stood with one hand on the rocks, waiting. At the last moment, as she went into her lunge, the ground shifted under her feet. The turtle, responding to Lukka's will, leaned over, sending her stumbling into a stone outcropping. Her sword was torn from her hand and clattered away. Lukka laughed.
"Did you forget where you were standing?"
As the turtle straightened, he drew his blade and stalked toward her.
"First thing we teach in the specials. Always be certain of your footing."
Drina scrabbled backward, panting, searching for a weapon. There was nothing but bare rock, and she was rapidly running out of that. Lukka cornering her at the edge of the turtle's mountainous back. She looked over her shoulder and saw only empty air and the ground far below.
"Surrender," Lukka said. "You know me, Drina. I'll be merciful."
There was a flash of pink on the ground, far below. Drina swallowed, and then for a second time in a few minutes, she hurled herself over the edge. This time, it was longer than a few yards, and she didn't close her eyes. The turtle's back blurred, the ground growing closer with terrifying speed, and only at the last moment was there a blur beneath her. She hit something as soft as yielding as a marshmallow. Roll gave a murp of protest, deflating like a punctured balloon, leaving Drina smothered in pink fuzz. She fought her way free and rolled off, the pink raccoon settling beside her.
"Brilliant plan," Lukka said from high above, "except for the part where you're now outside the walls. What now, Drina?"
Monsters were approaching from every direction. A nightmare with 8 legs and no eyes flowed across the ground beside a beast like a fox with long, curly-cued teeth. A dinosaur with a horn-rimmed head chuffed and lowered its nose, preparing to charge. Beside them, the turtle shifted around, opening a vast, razor-edged beak. A flapping bat-like thing took hold of Lukka with its claws and lifted him gently, spiraling downward to deposit him on the dirt in front of Drina and Roll. He spread his arms at the monsters that had them surrounded.
"Well,"
he said,
"what now?"
There was a deep creaking sound as the main gate opened. Drina pressed herself against Roll, not wanting to get trampled in the rush. Zeph was the first one out, with Barrow riding around his neck, electricity crackling around 2 sets of horns. The huge white cat grabbed the nightmare in its jaws, killed it with a quick shake, and tossed the body away with a derisive snort. The winged boar and the walking tree followed, and all the other bonded monsters with their bonders riding on their backs or following close behind. Bryn jumped down from Zeph's back and threw herself against Roll's side, and the pink raccoon gave a happy murp. Lukka's monsters fought back with vicious fury, but he had spread his army thin. Still, the rock turtle was still by his side, dwarfing even Zeph, and at a gesture it turned from the wall and lumbered forward. Its vast beak came down, grabbing the walking tree and tearing away a huge chunk of its wooden hide. The other bonder monsters scattered as it came on, but Drannith held her ground. Lukka's face was a mass of triumphant rage. An arrow flashed down from the battlements, sticking in the ground as it quivered to a halt. Green energy poured off of it, gathering into a shape larger than any Drannith had seen Vivien unleash before. It came into existence from the ground up, 2 huge, powerful legs, a long body and lashing tail like a dinosaur, but thick with multicolored feathers, a head that seemed to be mostly jaw and teeth. It was huge, nearly as big as the turtle. With a rumbling cry, the monstrous charged forward, slamming into the giant elemental, biting into the stone-tough flesh of its neck. The turtle wobbled, trying to get its beak around its opponent, its wild swaying, tossing the corpses of smaller monsters from its heights. The bonders and their monsters came forward again, surrounding Lukka while the dinosaur grappled with the turtle. He looked around wildly, and it was Drannith's turn to grin. "It's over, Lukka," Drannith said, stepping forward. "You know me. Surrender, and I'll be merciful." Lukka stared at Drannith and felt his rage rising. He pressed his knuckles against the hilt of his sword, rubbing them until they went white. No. He'd come too far, sacrificed too much. I won't let her stop me. Not now. All he'd wanted was to come home, but she and her god's cursed father hadn't let him. At every step, she'd stood in his way. Why? He searched her face, still achingly beautiful, even covered in the gore and grime of battle. What did I ever do wrong? He cast about for a solution, a way out. Think. He could feel his monsters, but none were close except for the damned useless turtle. None could reach him before Zeph, and the others tore him to pieces. But the energy of the ozolith still pulsed inside him. And there are monsters here after all. The bonders thought they could control their bonded creatures, but their power was nothing beside what he could draw on. I will have them. He spread his hands, eyes glowing with orange light. I will have them all. Excuse me? The voice at the back of his mind was the one from the ozolith, the one who'd offered him this power. I can't help but notice that the flow of energy through the crystal is getting a little out of hand. Shut up, Lukka muttered. He unleashed his will, power fountaining in all directions, and the bonded monsters visibly flinched away. Zeph tried to come toward him, hunched over, as though pushing into a storm. Lukka drew more power and let it flow through him, shoving the great white cat to his knees. I really must ask you to think again, the voice said. The consequences— Shut up! Lukka's power was pressing into the minds of the bonded monsters. He could feel it, but they were pushing back, driven by their love for their masters. They were fighting him in a way the wild monsters never had. Lukka grit his teeth and drew more power, then still more, smothering the monster's will in a tide of orange energy. It was working. Zeph turned, very slowly, to look at Drannith. The cat's lip curled back, baring its fangs. You will not stop me now. Lukka! Drannith's voice was a distant scream. Something flickered. Lukka looked over his shoulder and saw an orange spike of power, far to the north. The ozolith was screaming, energy coursing through it in unmanageable torrents, blasting into the sky in a pillar of incorporeal fire visible from the walls of Drannith. Lukka could feel the strain on the ancient crystal formation, feel the tiny pops as one by one the smaller crystals that surrounded the central spire cracked and shattered under the load. "Well," the voice said, "you can't say I didn't warn you." The ozolith exploded. A ring of orange light formed, blasting outward across the plains as the great crystal blew apart. Lukka's power surged through his mind, whipsawing wildly like a taut rope finally tearing free. Every monster in the circle shrieked or roared in pain, but these were only reflections of Lukka's own agony. He felt like his body was on fire, inside and out, fire inside his eyes and flowing through his veins. "I'm sorry, Jirina," he felt himself screaming. "I just wanted to go home." Deep inside his soul, something shifted, awakened by pain and blazing magic. A moment later, Lukka was gone, and the fabric of the plane folded itself neatly over the space where he had been. A week had passed, and somehow the sight of monsters in the marketplace had come to seem almost normal. The citizens of Drannith were an impressive bunch, Vivien had to admit. They'd begun rebuilding practically as soon as the monster corpses had been cleared away. Debris had been hauled off, broken buildings surrounded by scaffolds, new cobblestones laid, even gardens and lawns leveled and replanted. It was something the city had a lot of practice with, she supposed. That was less true of the monsters. After some hasty consultation with military authorities, Jirina had decreed that bonders and their monsters were not permitted inside the city proper, but would be welcomed in the first ring. This was partly a matter of practicality, since the larger monsters had difficulty maneuvering in the tight streets without damaging things, but mostly it was to keep incidents to a minimum. Vivien watched the crowds around the market, half fearful, half curious, keeping a good distance from where Zeph and Roll sat among some of the other bonders. Bryn was bounding from stall to stall, delighted at the variety of goods on offer, while Barrow followed at a more dignified pace. A small group of Citadel guards were visible on a side street, and Vivien pushed in that direction, threading her way through the crowd. The soldiers closed ranks at the sight of her, but Jirina waved them away. She had a neat new uniform, as befit her new rank of colonel, and a few nights of real food and regular sleep had left her looking considerably improved. "Vivien," Jirina said, "you're back." "Only briefly, I'm afraid," Vivien said. "Did you find anything?" "I did." Vivien had journeyed back north to the former site of the ozolith, hoping to find more evidence of what had happened there. What she'd uncovered had confirmed her suspicions. "But the person responsible is gone, and I must follow." "Ah," Jirina grinned. "What will you do when you find him?" "That depends on him, I suspect," Vivien said. "At the very least, I will give him a serious talking to." "Then I wouldn't like to be in his shoes," Jirina said. "Thank you for everything. Without you, without me, Lukka might not have escaped in the first place. Let us say that my role in this affair was mixed, and leave it at that." "Lukka," Jirina shook her head. "When the ozolith exploded, he just vanished. Do you think—" "I don't know," Vivien said. It wasn't quite a lie. "If he survived somehow, and you see him," Jirina took a breath, Tell him... Oh, I don't know. Tell him that I'm sorry things had to be this way. I will tell him, if it ever comes to that, Vivien said solemnly. She gestured at the market. And this? Do you think your citizens will accept this alliance with the Bonders and their monsters? For now, Drannith said. Everyone saw what the Bonders did for us. But people like my father have been teaching everyone in Drannith to hate monsters for generations. And that's hard to change. And the unbonded monsters are going to keep coming. In the long run, she shrugged. Who knows? I look forward to my next visit then. Vivien held out her hand, and after a moment, Drannith shook it. Good luck, Drannith. Good luck, Vivien. Vivien turned away, shifting the arc bow higher on her shoulder. She walked around the corner, down a narrow alley, and into another world. Lukka awoke in a swamp. He raised his head, slowly, black muck dripping from his face and hair. It was dark, and the air was warm and damp, and smelled of rot. Overhead, leaves rustled. I'm alive, he remembered. He sat up, shaking his head. His mind felt like it had been shattered and glued back together, so fragile that the slightest movement might shake it to pieces. His uniform was thick with the dark mud and scorched underneath that. In spite of everything, Lukka was a captain of the specials. Get moving, he admonished himself. Figure out where you are. Find shelter, food, and water. The rest can come later. He clambered to his feet, shaking off the mud. A moment later, a low, dangerous growl froze him in place. Red eyes gleamed in the darkness of the swamp. One set, then another, and another. The creatures came toward him, long and canine, paws splashing in the mud. The growl deepened. Lukka's hand went to his sword. At the same time, he reached out automatically with his will, wielding the power the Ozolith had granted him. Then he remembered the Ozolith had been destroyed. But at the same time, the creatures responded. One of them did, at least, its mind opening to him. It turned, growling deeper, and when one of its fellows raised its hackles, the creature pounced. A rolling scuffle ensued, ending with the two beasts not under Lukka's control fleeing back into the swamps. The creature he'd taken hold of waited for him obediently, bleeding where the other's jaws had torn it. Lukka stumbled over and put his hand on its furry shoulder. This isn't anywhere near Drannith. He wasn't sure, in fact, that he was still on the same world. What Vivien had told him, it wasn't important. What mattered was that he was alive, and some remnant of the power he'd wielded clung to him still. It wasn't as strong as it had been, but it would be enough. Lukka found his lips curling into a bitter smile. Someday, I will make it home.